guys. Last week you learned a little bit about the scientific method and what makes psychology a science. Today we're going to dig a little bit more into that and start discussing, how do you come up with a research idea, and then how do you even start the steps to try and dive into the research that you want to conduct. So the very first steps of a research process is obviously generating some type of research idea. And usually this comes from a topic of interest. What interests you? And this differs for all of us. Thank goodness we're all unique. Otherwise, we'd all be researching the exact same thing. Now, this topic could come from, something that you've historically been interested in, something that is more like a new question that came about because of society at the time, something that interests you because of a family member or it's happened to somebody else, or just because that's just your general interest. So you need to explore any type of ideas that are of interest to you, and eventually you'll come down to some larger or general topic idea. The next step after that is to form a hypothesis. Now, it's not always this easy, because when you think about it, you're like, oh, I'm interested in memories and long-term memory. Well, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of publications on just memory. You have to, start bringing it down to something a little bit more manageable, a much more narrow topic. So when you're doing that, or when you're thinking, okay, well, I've come up with my idea in terms of memories and versus short term, I'm interested in more long-term memories. Well, you might start looking into some sources, okay? So pick sources that, are interest to you, that, you're curious about, maybe that, you've observed in the past, or other people's observations, okay? Maybe somebody's asked you a question about something, and therefore that's kind of sprung a little interest in you. You can look at academic materials, you could look at magazines, obviously, and we'll talk about this, but some sources are way more reputable than others, and you need to consider that when you're actually citing the material. So when you're looking into these sources to try and narrow down what you actually want to really look into, and then what you're going to use for your research paper, you need to consider primary and secondary sources. Okay, primary sources are sources that come firsthand. Okay, these are they've come directly from the author. Okay, so a primary source is a firsthand report of observations or of research that have been written by the individual who actually observed it or did that research. Okay, a secondary source, on the other hand, is a description or a summary of another person's work. Okay, so if you look in textbooks or you look in a newspaper or whatever it might be, these are often secondary sources, because they aren't coming directly from the individual who conducted the research. Now, both primary and secondary sources play important roles, obviously, in the literature search, but secondary sources aren't as reliable, because they're obviously a summation of what the primary source had said. So you want to always go back to the primary source. So if you read something in the newspaper, okay, well, sometimes journalists have their own way of spinning ideas, okay, just because they want to sell the article, or if it's in a newspaper, or in a magazine. Okay, so you always want to go back to that original source, because the primary source is what is often the most reliable source. All right, so the purpose of our literature search, and we're going to get into this in lab as to like how to go about searching the literature, but two basic goals that you have when you are looking for your literature. One is to gain a familiarity with the current research in your specific area of interest, okay? So it's basically to get you familiar with what's been done, who maybe the big names are within this area. And also then, so once you kind of find a broad idea, okay, now you need to find more relevant research studies that serve in your main research idea. So like I said, maybe I'm interested in long-term memories. Well, long-term memories, like I said, is a very broad topic, okay? So now I need to shorten it. Well, I'm interested in more specifically in terms of children's long-term memories, okay? Well, again, that's quite broad as well. So then, well, I'm actually interested in the accuracy of their long-term memories And not just their accuracy, but their accuracy when they're being questioned under stressful conditions, when they've experienced a stressful event. Okay, so maybe children who have witnessed a car crash or a domestic violence incident, or who have, witnessed a school shooting. Okay, these are then what I'm talking about in terms of narrowing down your topic. Okay, I started off thinking about long-term memories. Then I went into children's long-term memories. Then I went into more, I wanted to understand the accuracy of their long-term memories. And then not just the accuracy of any event that they've experienced, but a stressful event. And then as well as that, how they're questioned. Okay, because these kids who have experienced something, a stressful event, they're often questioned by police, by social services, by their parents, by teachers, whatever it might be, and how could that affect their memory. Okay, so this is where you need to then, maybe I started just researching long-term memories, then childhood long-term memories, and then I started getting a little bit more specific in terms of the literature that I'm looking at. Now, your goal, though, as a researcher is start to fill in the gaps of what's already been found, okay? So maybe, I start reading this literature on childhood memories or the accuracy of childhood memories for stressful events, and I noticed that a lot of it has to do with personal stressful events, meaning like it specifically happened to them, like they were the victim of it. But what happens maybe when they are just a bystander? Okay, maybe they weren't in the car accident, but they were watching the car in front of them get hit by a train. Okay, so it didn't necessarily, they weren't actually the victim, but they were the ones witnessing it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a gap in that knowledge that you want to try and fill. Okay, or maybe, all of this research has only been done on younger children, like preschool kids, but maybe they've never looked at, adolescent or middle school or elementary school kids, okay? So again, trying to find, what's missing in this literature and how can we fill in that gap. So when you conduct a literature search, like I said, I'm going to go over this in lab, but your purpose is to start narrowing down your research idea and starting to find the articles that specifically start to target that idea. All right, so where is this literature relevant? Obviously, it's relevant in everything. It's going to help you write your introduction. It's going to help you figure out your methodology, who your participants are, what you're going to actually do. And then it'll also help in terms of your writing up your conclusion or your discussion section. So I'm just going to go over quickly the components of a research article. Okay, so you have the introduction. Okay, the introduction includes the literature review. Okay, and the literature review, it starts out very broad. Okay, it might start talking about childhood memories, and eventually it gets into stressful events, and then it starts to get into people questioning them and how their accuracy might change. And then it starts talking about, where that gap is in the literature. Well, talking more about, these are personal events, but, we really don't know anything about when children aren't necessarily the victim of a stressful event, but just a witness of a stressful event. And so that's where it gets into. Okay, then you get into your hypothesis, and you form a specific hypothesis based on what the literature says. Then we get into methodology, okay, and we'll talk more specifically about that, but that's basically who your participants are and what did they do. The results, obviously, you've all had statistics, so we'll get into that, and then the discussion is wrapping up, summarizing the results and how it ties back into the previous literature, and then obviously our references. All right, so hypotheses, real quick, okay? You need to form a hypothesis. Okay, now what makes a good hypothesis? Well, we always say, well, what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is an educated guess, right? Or a prediction that you've made. Yes, it is. Okay, but there are some characteristics that make some hypotheses better than others. So one, it has to be logical. Okay, obviously, it has to have a logical conclusion to the argument. It has to be testable. If your hypothesis isn't testable, okay, then there's no point in doing it. Like, for instance, young children can see good or evil auras surrounding the people they meet. Well, that's not testable, okay? Because we can't see these good or evil auras that kids are seeing, right? So it has to be testable, meaning that we can measure the variables, or we can manipulate the events, or we can, ask individuals about the variables we're interested in. Okay? It needs to be refutable, meaning that we can demonstrate that it's false. Okay? Or refutable means it must be possible to obtain research results that are contrary to the hypothesis. So one that can be demonstrated to be false. And the other thing, the hypothesis needs to be positive. Okay, so in science, the basic nature of science is to assume that something does not exist until we can actually support that it does exist, okay? Until we find evidence to demonstrate that it actually does exist. So why would we say there's no relationship between I don't know, the sun out during the day and I don't know, my mood? Okay, well, if we find that there's no relationship, or we believe there's no relationship, why study it? Okay, so we want to look for something that we believe there is this relationship, or there's something there between variables. Okay. All right, so that's the end. Again, we're going to continue to build on this throughout the semester and talk more about this in lab. Bye.